Thank you, Alicia. Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Thrush, and I'm the project coordinator at Equitas, and welcome to today's webinar called Igniting the Conversation and Improving Our Response to Stalking. This is a webinar that's made possible through funding from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Office on Violence Against Women, and this presentation will discuss stalking awareness efforts that can be engaged in locally throughout the year, and we'll introduce the training, technical assistance, and resources that will be made available to you and your colleagues through the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center, which we are calling SPARC. Today's presenter is Jennifer Landheis, my colleague here at Equitas, and Jennifer is the director of this SPARC Center, the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center at Equitas. Jennifer has been an advocate and an educator on the issues of stalking, domestic violence, and sexual assault for 20 years, and she has her Master's of Science degree in Criminal Justice and is based out of Idaho. We'll be providing the full biography for Jennifer after today's presentation, and as Alicia said, in the chat box you'll see the PDF of the slide presentation from today's webinar in the materials box on your screen. So you can download that and follow along, and we'll also be able to send that after the presentation as well. Equitas's mission is to improve the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices that increase victim safety and offender accountability. Our staff is comprised of former prosecutors with over 100 years of collective experience, and they conduct legal research and provide 24/7 case consultation. They serve as mentors and instructors around the country, and we publish resources. So throughout the presentation, feel free to use the chat box that Alicia mentioned to ask any questions you might have, and if we have time, we'll be able to answer them during the webinar, or we'll be able to follow up afterwards and address your questions then. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to Jennifer for the substantive portion of today's webinar.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Alicia, for all the work that you do on the background to make this a success today. I also want to thank all of you on the call. Thank you for taking time to join us this morning or this afternoon, depending on which time zone you're checking in from. I know many of you have very full plates, and I appreciate the time that you're putting in to spend some time with us today learning more about the SPARC project and what we can do to assist in your awareness and your response efforts. So we have a few objectives for our webinar today. I'm not going to read them to you, but what I am going to say is what we really want to try to do is lay the foundation about the awareness and response efforts that SPARC can assist you with as we move forward. And we also know that sometimes webinars can be a little bit hard to engage with. So we've put some polls into the webinar, not only to help you feel engaged, but also for us to have a better understanding about who's on the call and what some of the areas of priority we might need to focus on as we look forward for the next few years as SPARC develops. Which leads to our very first question on the poll, which is, what discipline do you represent? If you'll go ahead and just, Alicia will bring up the poll for us, and then you can just type your response in, and then it's a real-time response, so we'll be able to see quickly who's on the call. Great. It looks like we have quite a few of us on the call that are representing the advocacy and direct service providers. My background is in advocacy, so thank you all for being on the call. But we also looks like we have several representatives from law enforcement, from corrections, and campus personnel. This just goes to show us what we already know, that there's a variety of individuals that stalking victims are accessing when it comes to stalking cases and looking for resources in their community. But what we also know is that stalking is extremely unreported. There's limited research about the exact rates, but we know that victims state they don't come forward, primarily because they're concerned nobody will believe them. They perhaps worry that the system can't or won't do anything to help them. And they believe sometimes that an intervention on behalf of those of us within the criminal justice system might actually result in some type of reprisals from the stalker. So given the fact that most victims report or state that they're not reporting and that they worry about an adequate response from those of us within the criminal justice system, Alicia, can you bring up the next poll for us? How are you prioritizing stalking cases within your jurisdiction? What does that look like? Do you have dedicated professionals and projects? Are you considering stalking, but usually only within the context of domestic violence? Or are those stalking cases being overlooked mostly because of limited knowledge or resources? So not surprising, what you're seeing on the screen in front of you is most of you are answering that we're considering stalking cases, but usually within the context of domestic violence. And so while we're happy that many of you are considering those cases, what we also know is that stalking happens not only within the context of domestic violence. Approximately 60% of stalking victims are stalked by a current or former intimate partner, but that leaves 40% who are not. So those 40% are usually stalked by an acquaintance, somebody that they've worked with or gone to school with, ran into. Very rarely are they stalked by a stranger. Sometimes they're stalked by family members. So when we look at the response to stalking, although it's great that we're analyzing stalking within the context of domestic violence, we also really need to be thinking about what are we doing for those individuals who are experiencing stalking and it's not within the context of domestic violence. I'm also excited to see that some of you said we are absolutely prioritizing stalking. We've got dedicated professionals and projects in what we're doing. You can go ahead and take that poll down. Thanks, Alicia. So what we need to understand is when we're talking about stalking as a priority, as a system, we have to be able to increase our capacity not only to identify stalking, but also to figure out like what are some of our interventions that are necessary. Part of the identifying process is not only to figure out about awareness activities, but also to figure out what does our response efforts look like. So one of the questions that we would like to ask all of you is another poll. What kind of activities do you engage in throughout the year to promote stalking awareness? As many of you are probably well aware, January is Stalking Awareness Month. This was the 14th anniversary of stalking awareness being declared by our legislature through some efforts of individuals who are really trying to get our communities to focus on the issue of stalking, not only within the context of domestic violence, but outside of the context of domestic violence. And one of the things we really want to concentrate on here at SPARC is not only promoting awareness about stalking in January, which happens to be Stalking Awareness Month, but really throughout the year. How do we help individuals recognize stalking? How do we improve our responses to stalking? How do we incorporate stalking within our domestic violence and sexual violence responses? And how do we really carry out those awareness activities throughout the entire year? So many of you are saying that your resources have a tendency to be either promotion of stalking resources with other professionals. Some of you are saying it's a combination of both, that you have some materials on your website or in print. Others of you are saying we really focus on our social media presence. Not surprising, the media interviews and opinion pieces, I think we're getting to the day and age where those are not as prevalent as they used to be, and that social media is really what we're concentrating on, which is reflected in the answers that all of you have above. And you can go ahead and take that slide down as well, Alicia. So what we really want to think about as we look at awareness efforts and what activities that we're doing is that how are we making stalking a priority throughout the year? How are we really focusing our efforts not only in promoting ongoing awareness, but really understanding that stalking cases are often overlooked. I think that as a system, as a criminal justice system, it's fair to say that we are often incident-based. So we're usually looking at an individual act. So for instance, a victim may have come in to seek shelter or to seek a protection order, or they're reporting to us as law enforcement because of one specific thing that happened. What's difficult with stalking is those specific behaviors aren't always criminal in and of themselves. For example, it's not criminal to drive down a public street. It might not be criminal to send a text message. And it isn't until we view those particular incidents within the entire context of what's happening and the entire pattern of the behavior that's happening to the victim, that's usually when we're recognizing that it's a stalking crime. But when those individual incidents happen and people come forward, we may not put together the pieces to understand that this is a stalking case. So we have to be able to increase not only our response efforts, but also our identification process. So part of that is not only raising awareness in our broader communities and society, but also raising awareness within our own profession. Sometimes we hear from victims that they feel discounted or dismissed by the very system that's supposed to protect them. And so in the last 20 years, we've made really great strides in our abilities to intervene and respond to domestic and sexual violence, but have we made the same strides when it comes to stalking? I sometimes jokingly say when I'm at a large conference or other gathering of criminal justice professionals that people will often say, well, we address domestic and sexual violence. And then I'm always quietly saying, and stalking, and stalking, and stalking, because oftentimes it feels like we don't necessarily reflect the priority that stalking should take in these particular instances. For example, I would encourage you to think about, does your agency name reflect your ability to serve victims of stalking? Do your mission statements reflect your abilities to be able to reach victims of stalking? Do your outreach office efforts, are your policies and protocols specific to stalking, or are they domestic violence and sexual assault protocols that you just adapt to stalking? And one of the reasons that we really want to take a close look at that is, as I mentioned, although 60% of stalking cases do occur within the context of domestic violence, that's not the only way that they occur. So when we talk about promoting ongoing awareness, one of the things that we really want to think about is starting that conversation early. And by early, I don't mean 7 o'clock in the morning, but I mean with our teenagers. What kind of information and awareness are we promoting within the 18 to 24-year-old age group? We know that stalking happens the most frequently. The highest rate of stalking actually happens to individuals who are between the ages of 18 to 24. But so often we are overcoming what we call the normalization of stalking. So we work with teens and those who work with teens who will say things like, well, yeah, the teenagers that we work with getting 250 text messages within a 2-hour span isn't unusual. Or we oftentimes see it normalized as, well, somebody's really into somebody else. They really want to, be with that person. They really like that person. And we have a hard time sometimes drawing that line between what is normal relationship dynamics, especially within an 18, 20 to 24-year-old age group, and what really crosses the line into the issue of stalking, and where do we draw that line? So one of the things that we would encourage you to think about is, what do the conversations look like that you're having with not only the 18 to 24-year-old age group, but even younger than that? What does that look like, and how do we help those particular individuals understand what's normal and what's not, particularly in the day and age of social media and all the technologies and being plugged into one another all the time? That can be difficult for especially individuals who are under the age of 24 to really understand what's possessive and controlling and what's normal relationship behavior look like, especially if they've never been exposed to relationships that are healthy and have those normal boundaries. The other thing that we would think about when we talk about promoting ongoing awareness is really trying to leverage the resources that we already have. So because we know that stalking often co-occurs in domestic violence as well as sexual violence, what are some of the resources and responses that we have? Is that materials? Is that social media presence? Is it policies and procedures that we can also leverage when it comes to stalking cases? What have we already built? It's not about reinventing the wheel. I imagine none of you have extra time and space to create brand new policies, but it's about taking what we already have. Can those be tweaked for stalking interventions? The other thing that I want to encourage you to think about is if some of these things are ringing true to you that I'm talking about today, and you're thinking, yeah, we really could use better protocols, or we can really use better awareness efforts when it comes to stalking, reach out to us at SPARC. That's what we're here for. That's what we want to help you with. And we know also that we can't do this work alone. We're a small office. We cover the entire United States, and what I know is that there's many of you on this phone call who are doing amazing awareness and response efforts when it comes to stalking. Share those with us. It is oftentimes that we go across the country and we'll be sharing, well, you know what, they're doing in New Jersey could really be helpful here in California, or this particular agency in Texas has come up with a really great social media platform about stalking that we would love to share with everyone else. So we know that we can't do this work alone, and we know that many of you are doing fantastic work when it comes to stalking. So please, let's make sure that we share information like that. And please reach out to those of us at SPARC, because we'd be happy to share that information with all of you and assist you in your efforts. So it doesn't look like we have any questions on the chat so far. Please don't be shy and hesitant to use that. You're more than welcome to use the chat, and I'll pause occasionally to check it out. But if you have any questions about awareness efforts, the other thing that I would mention to you is we still do have the Stalking Awareness Month website up and running right now. Next year for 2019, all that information will be updated and sent out to all of you so that you can continue your efforts. But like I said earlier, we'd encourage you to think about not just January, but the entire year. How do we promote awareness about stalking within everything that we're doing? So let's also talk a little bit about our response efforts. What do those look like, and what are we doing to really ignite the response? And like I said earlier, this has to be a collaboration. It has to be those of us that are working at SPARC, listening to, understanding, responding, learning from all of you in the field. One of the things that I appreciate most about going out and providing training and technical assistance is really hearing about the great work that all of you are doing, but also hearing about what some of your barriers are. What things are you running into? What could we assist with as far as training and resources that really can improve your response about stalking? Because we know that the prevalence rates versus the response rates are really disproportionate. The prevalence rates, most recent prevalence rates, are a staggering 7.5 million people are stalked every year in the U.S. That's about 1 in 7 women and 1 in 18 men who will experience stalking sometime in their lifetime. So if we know the prevalence rates are that high, almost as high as that of sexual assault and almost as high as that of domestic violence, what do our response rates look like? Are we having response rates that are reflecting the prevalence rate? And some of that comes from victims' reluctance to come forward, which might take us analyzing what is it about our system that makes victims reluctant to come forward. But it's also really understanding that collaborations, especially with stalking cases, are absolutely key. Not only your local collaborations, but your statewide and your national collaborations as well. And really trying to figure out how do you ignite the efforts within your own community. Many of you that are on the phone, I recognize some of your names, and I know without a doubt that you are movers and shakers on these issues within your communities. And what are you doing to assist with those efforts, particularly to stalking? We know that collaborations are key, and it's something we absolutely believe in here at SPARC. And so one of the things that we did when we applied for the OVW funding was really leverage some of the partners that we have, national partners that we have, including the individuals that you see up on the list up here. So the Battered Women's Justice Project, NCJ, FCJ, IACP, the National Immigrant Women's Project, Red Wind Consulting, which for those of you who are not familiar with those TA providers, they provide TA particularly to tribal jurisdictions, the Victims' Rights Law Center, Clery Center. I don't need to read the entire list to you, but what I do need to emphasize to you is that we knew right from the beginning that this was going to take a collaborative effort. We knew that we couldn't do it alone. We are hoping that what comes of this project not only is our ability to help grantees understand the response to stalking and increase their ability to respond to stalking victims, but also assisting our other technical assistance providers who may have specific resources and insight that might not be encompassing of stalking. So really trying to figure out how do we also help other TA providers figure out what they need to do regarding their technical assistance and training around stalking, and also having them inform us, what do we need to do at SPARC to really make sure that our response efforts are reflective of what's actually happening in the field. So of those partners that you saw on the first slide, we had a smaller number of partners agree to be part of what we are calling a leadership collaborative. And so the intention behind a leadership collaborative was really to say, we know that we hear some of what's going on in the field, but we don't hear everything. And so what we really need is a group of people who are going to work together to really focus on some of the emerging issues that we see come up about stalking. So some of the things that we thought about are, who are those individuals that can participate in the leadership collaborative? So that collaborative is going to meet monthly in the very beginning and then quarterly thereafter to really take a good look at some of the efforts across the U.S. and figure out what's needed in regards to stalking efforts, what's missing, what some of our barriers might be. So the individuals that you see listed up on this particular screen are those individuals that are going to participate in that leadership collaborative. I'm anxious and excited to begin to work with all of them. They're an amazing group of organizations doing amazing work. And I'm also excited we're going to continue to analyze what's going on in the field and really help us figure out what kind of resources are missing and what kind of things we can really do to focus and increase our response to stalking. I know that for myself as an individual, I was doing this work for probably 5 or 6 years before stalking really even got on my radar. I would work with victims of domestic violence whose partners would be really controlling of them, who would monitor where they were at all the time, who if the victim left them, would chase them down, find them, figure out what they were doing. But I never identified that as stalking. I always just said, oh, that's part of domestic violence, they're really controlling. I never specifically identified it as stalking, never talked about it as stalking, never talked with the victims that I was working with and identified that it was stalking. And I really feel like I did a huge disservice to those individuals. Number one, it's a separate crime if we're looking at response. And number two, we know that victims of domestic violence who experience stalking those are victims who are at a really high risk of being hurt or killed by their partner. And so by missing that and not pulling it out and identifying it as a specific issue, I was doing a disservice because I wasn't safety planning around those issues with the victims that I was working with. So part of what we need to understand when we're really looking at increasing our collaborative efforts is coming up with a common definition of stalking. Now, each of the 50 states has a statutory definition about stalking. They're all different. They each contain certain elements, but most of them have components of what we refer to as the behavioral definition of stalking. So we use the definition that stalking is a pattern of behavior that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And I want to spend a couple of minutes breaking down that definition, which seems pretty simple, but in particular, I want to call out the pattern of behavior. We know that stalking victims often experience a variety of tactics from their stalker. So for instance, we may have a stalker who's calling or sending text messages, and when that doesn't seem to have an effect on the victim, then they start showing up in person. And if that doesn't work, then they post on social media. So we know that the pattern of behavior can sometimes be difficult for us to identify because the behavior isn't always a repeat of the same tactics. But oftentimes when we're looking at the pattern of behavior, it's a pattern of numerous incidents. So I would encourage you to think about how many incidents do we need for a pattern. We would say it's 2 or more. And those 2 incidents might not meet the criminal threshold for us to be able to charge somebody with stalking, but they certainly meet the behavioral definition. We also say that stalking is directed at a specific person, but we know that it's quite common in stalking cases for things to happen that we call target dispersion. So meaning if a stalker is stalking a specific person and they're not having the results that they want and the victim's not reacting in the way that they want to, then they start to target the people that are close to the victim. So perhaps they target the victim's children or the victim's family or people that work with the victim, because that usually will get a response from the victim. So although we say it's directed at a specific person, we also have to keep in mind that target dispersion is something that happens very frequently when we talk about stalking cases. And then the final piece of this definition that I think is really important is that it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. When I'm doing in-person trainings and I can interact with all of you, I always say, well, why do we include reasonable person? Like, do we not think victims are reasonable people? Why is that part of the definition? And many people will be able to articulate quickly that's usually part of jury instructions. But what you also need to keep in mind is just like with domestic violence or sexual violence, individuals who experience stalking oftentimes minimize what's happening in that relationship. And many times when they come forward to talk to all of us, it isn't that they are articulating fear. They're articulating being frustrated, being upset, being mad, being to the point where they just don't know what to do with themselves anymore. But they don't necessarily articulate fear. And so one of the things we need to think about when we talk about a reasonable person to feel fear is, what does fear look like? What does it look like in behaviors? What are some of the emotions that might actually mask fear, like annoyance and frustration? And we also need to keep in mind, the best example I can give you is I worked with a stalking victim who one time responded to a law enforcement office. So it was part of my job to respond when law enforcement received a domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking call. And in this particular case, I'm old, so I'm pre-cell phone. I know that's hard for a lot of you to even, fathom, but back in the day, in this particular instance, this victim had come into the law enforcement office to make a report about a violation of protection order. And her stalker was a former intimate partner who would show up out at her place, harass her, yell at her, and in this particular incident, he had cut her landline phone. And so she came in, and what she said to us is, I want to report this violation of a protection order because he threatened to kill me. So as I'm talking with her in the lobby, we sent 2 deputies out to the farmhouse to respond, hoping that he was still going to be out of the farmhouse, and he was indeed there. But as the deputies are responding, she turns to me inside the lobby of the law enforcement office, and she says, are they going to take his gun? And I said, well, what gun? What do you mean? And she goes, oh, when I said he threatened to kill me, he actually had a loaded 9mm that he had pointed at me. And I said, hold on just a second, let me go tell dispatch, because that's kind of something law enforcement wants to know when they respond. And now inside of my head, I'm thinking, why did she not tell us this? Why would this not be something that you mentioned? So when I went back to the room, I said, I'm curious why you didn't mention the gun earlier. And she said, well, that's something he does all the time. He would never shoot me. Now, obviously, that's an extreme example of minimization, but it's one that is reflective of what we experience with a lot of individuals that we work with, that they minimize the danger to themselves or the danger that the individual might pose to responding law enforcement or to those of us in the system. So when we say a reasonable person, it's important to keep in mind that sometimes victims minimize, and oftentimes victims' emotions like frustration will actually mask the element of fear. So when we look at the pattern of the behavior, what does that look like? For those of you that are familiar with the information put out by Dr. T.K. Logan, she's a phenomenal researcher on stalking, and she just put out a really great publication that really helps kind of provide some great framework for what it is when we talk about a course of conduct or a pattern of behavior. Now, some of the practitioners on the phone might be like, I really don't care what the research says. What I found really helpful is she put into words what we knew about stalking and provided us a way to really document it in a clear and concise way, which we know will only improve our responses as law enforcement, as victim services providers. So what she did is really talk about what are the classifications of some of the tactics that stalkers engage in. So she broke it down into 4 things. The first one is surveillance. So not surprisingly, those things are things like following the victim, watching the victim either through some form of technology or from afar, perhaps in getting other people to watch the victim, waiting somewhere where the victim might be or showing up where the victim's expected to be, using some kind of tracking software, or engaging in what we call proxy stalking. Now, proxy stalking is when the offender, usually because they're court-ordered, have to stay away from a victim, and so they get their brother, their best friend, somebody else to engage in the stalking behavior towards the victim. So that covers the surveillance tactics. There's also what we call life invasion. I think life invasion, in my experience of working with stalking victims, is perhaps the thing that is most frustrating for victims and the thing that causes the most emotional trauma. Because it seems like for many victims that the offender is intruding on every aspect of their life. So it's things like unwanted contact at home or work or school, the constant phone calls. It may be what we call property invasion, so trespassing when they're not supposed to be somewhere. It oftentimes involves things like public humiliation, so manipulating social media, as they live in a small town, just spreading rumors, harassing their friends and family. The life invasion piece of things is what victims will really articulate is so frustrating for them, because many times it might not necessarily be a criminal incident, so we as a criminal justice system might not be able to get involved, but it's something that is so pervasive and so traumatizing for the victim that it's really difficult to deal with. The third piece that you see listed up there is intimidation. So it can be things like threats or property damage. It might be things like forced confrontation, so confronting the victim in a grocery store or someplace where other people will see and humiliating them. It might be that the stalker is threatening to harm themselves. or threatening to commit suicide or harm someone else. And it could be that the perpetrator is threatening either the target or somebody or something that's important to the victim. So like the victim's pets, property, that type of a thing. And then the last one is the interference piece. So it can be things like financial and work sabotage. It might be ruining a victim's reputation. It could be custody interference or keeping a victim from leaving a certain location, actually physically attacking friends and family or the victim. And those particular behaviors all make up the pattern of behavior that many stalkers engage in with victims. But what can be hard is when victims come forward, they may tell one piece of the tactic, one piece of the information to say their advocate. And then when law enforcement responds to their slashed tires, the victim only talks about the slashed tires and not about the other pieces of behavior that have been happening to them. And so what we find many times in stalking cases is that the information is shared with some of us, but not all of us, and that sometimes we have only bits and pieces of the larger puzzle. And I think what's essential to all of this is what I talked about earlier, is that we still have a hard time figuring out what does fear look like? What does it mean for victims? How do we really pay attention to the fear that they're expressing and really continue to build our understanding of what that looks like? We've got to remember that fear is cumulative. It's not just this particular incident, but it's because they've had so many other incidents in the past. And we also have to keep in mind that it interferes with so many aspects of victims' life that the psychological harm is just as traumatizing as the physical harm. And so you see the quote up there from a victim who said that, you know, the normal everyday activities like going to work and attending our kids' activities, going out for the evening, that those seem routine for most people, but for me it's terrifying because I never know what he's going to do or when he's going to show up. And I think that particular quote is really reflective of what most victims say, that the fear is something that interferes with every aspect of their life, and that it is cumulative. It's not just this particular incident that's affecting them, but it's been this entire pattern of behavior. And so where we often run into difficulty when we're really trying to analyze what is our response to stalking victims is how do we corroborate what they're saying? How do we, you know, if we're lucky when we get a stalking case, we may have copies of a text message, we may have screenshots, we may have a certain social media presence, but many times what happens is victims who experience stalking behavior, so for instance, if they get a threatening text message or they get a message via social media that upsets them, what they many times do is end up deleting the message or deleting the evidence because it's counterintuitive to keep it. It's emotionally damaging, it hurt me, I end up deleting it. And so when it comes to stalking cases, where we often run into difficulty is how do we corroborate those cases and how do we gather the evidence that we need to go forward with stalking charges? And so one of the things that we highly recommend is that victims keep what we call a documentation log. It's been my experience that many people who have worked with stalking victims say, absolutely, I tell victims to keep a journal all the time. But when we really start to have that conversation, what service providers tell me is, oh, I told her to keep a journal, but I didn't tell her what to keep in the journal or how to keep a journal or what to, you know, what particular things are important. And so what happens sometimes is a victim keeps a journal and then victims go into law enforcement with a 500-page journal and say, this is all the documentation about the stalking incident. And I love my police officers, and I know that they don't have a ton of time, and they might not have the time to read a 500-page journal. What we also run into trouble with is if victims have put in the journal things like, you know, it doesn't bother me when he shows up at home. I expect him to do that, but it really bothers me when he shows up at my work. If a victim writes that in a journal and the journal is used in a criminal case and it goes forward to the prosecution then has to give it to the defense, who's going to share it with the perpetrator. And so then we've educated the perpetrator that, oh, it doesn't bother her when I show up at home, but it really bothers her when I show up at work. Well, guess where he's going to show up the next time? At work. So when we think about keeping a journal of events, what we really need to think about is how do we keep a log, including the date and time, a brief description of the incident, if there were any witnesses, so anybody that happened to be around the victim, saw what happened. I think that where we miss a lot of witnesses is many victims will be on the phone with somebody, they might be FaceTiming somebody, and that particular person heard what happened or saw what happened, but we forget to think of them as a witness because they're not physically present. And then we also want to include, if the police were called, who is the officer's name and badge number? One of the difficulties with stalking cases that we know is that oftentimes they're crossing jurisdictions. So we have a victim who lives in one city, who works in another city, and whose mom lives in the third city. And so we may have incidents that happen in each of those jurisdictions, but no jurisdiction usually has the information from the other jurisdiction. And when we ask victims, well, who did you report it to? Who did you have contact with? Victims don't understand jurisdiction. That's confusing to lots of people. They don't understand that if I report something to the city police, that the county sheriff might not have that information. And so they get frustrated. They say, I've already reported this. Why do you not have the prior reports? Why aren't you able to pull those up? And so the documentation log assists us with being able to build that case and really show not only where the different jurisdictions that it's happening, but also help us if we have to pull evidence and figure out if reports have been made before, what does that look like? And you'll notice that on this particular log, we do not have on here how it made the victim feel, which some of you are saying, well, my particular state statute says a victim had to feel fear. I can tell you that victims oftentimes forget, where the particular incident happens. They might forget the particular day or even which officer they talked to. They do not forget how the incident made them feel. So there's no need to document that if that is in turn going to be given over to the defense. The other thing we need to continue to think about, and I've mentioned earlier, is so often each of us holds unique information. And really where oftentimes we see stalking cases fall through the cracks is the lack of time and ability to put the pieces of the case together on the behalf of those of us in the system. So I would encourage you to think about, for those of you on the phone, I would be willing to bet that many of you have coordinated community response teams that are either addressing domestic violence and sexual violence or just sexual violence. And my question to you would be, are you also addressing stalking? And the answer usually is the same as the first poll that we took, which is, well, yes, within the context of domestic violence. But those same things that we have in place, like I mentioned earlier, same policies, same protocols that we use for domestic violence could also be applied to stalking. Why are our CCRs not addressing these particular issues? And in particular, are we really looking at a multi-jurisdictional response? It's been my experience with stalking cases that they do so often spill over into different jurisdictions that having a response team that's made up of multiple jurisdictions, so for instance, it's not just a particular city response or not just a particular county response, but more of a regional response system, can be very beneficial when we look at responding to stalking cases. And then really understanding what does collaboration look like, not only for your outreach, but your training issues. Many individual organizations have policies and protocols in place that require annual training on sexual or domestic violence. Do you include stalking? Is it only within the context of domestic violence? I think the other thing that we need to be thinking about when we talk about collaboration is, who are we involving? What individuals might victims be accessing for assistance? On the first poll that we took, those of you on the phone represent a variety of organizations and structures. And so who's being invited to the table to talk about these cases? The more people we have at the table, the easier it is going to be to form a really coordinated and effective response. So let's be thinking about that when we talk about our response efforts, particularly in the issue of stalking. So before I move to the final part of our webinar, which is really talking about the work that SPARC is doing, does anybody have any questions? If you do, please feel free to put them in the chat. Webinars are always so hard. As somebody who loves training, I very much realize when I do webinars that I rely so much on audience participation and feedback. That it's a little hard when you're staring at your computer and not getting any of that. So please, if you have questions, reach out to us. After the webinar, feel free to put them in the chat. We're happy to provide one-on-one technical assistance, which leads us to our final set of slides, which is really, oh, go ahead.
Jennifer, we do have a few on the chat box if you'd like me to read them out. There's a question about a stalking danger assessment, and then what potential consequences might be in keeping a log and not telling the police if they ever go to court. Would it be counted against them?
Oh, okay. Those are great questions. Sorry, I'm not seeing those pop up in the chat, so thank you, Emily, for interrupting. So the first one is about stalking risk assessment. So I'm going to put an actual, give me 1 second because I can't type and talk. I'm going to put a website here in the chat. Hopefully, did that go to everybody? I'm not seeing them show up on my side. So otherwise,
it did, yeah, coercivecontrol.org.
Yeah, so coercivecontrol.org is the website for SPARC, which is a stalking, harassment, assessment, and risk profile. That particular assessment was designed by Dr. T.K. Logan, who we talked about here in today's webinar. It's a brand new assessment. It's only been out for about a year, so many people are not familiar with it. And most folks who are doing risk assessments are using domestic violence specific ones, which are applicable if the stalker's intimate partner, and I would say if you have a victim who's experienced stalking within the context of domestic violence, you should be doing both a domestic violence risk assessment and the stalking specific assessment, because there's lots of things that are missed in the DV assessment that have to do with stalking. And obviously, if you have a stalking victim who's not related to their intimate partner, those DV risk assessments aren't going to be any good. But if you go to coercivecontrol.org, it's a free risk assessment. You just go on there and it says enter a profile. You do not have to have the victim enter the profile themselves. You as a practitioner can do that. And what it does is kind of spit back information about certain things that you should be paying attention to with your safety planning. It talks about particular risk factors. So it's a really great assessment that I found incredibly useful when working with stalking victims to be able to highlight those particular issues that are kind of red flags for us. So I highly encourage you to use it. What I will tell you is for those of you who are like first responders, so you might be a patrol officer, it's not going to be something that you're likely able to have the time to be able to do on the scene. I'm pretty familiar with it, so I can do one in about 30 minutes, but it might take a little bit longer for people who are unfamiliar with the assessment. But considering most of you on the phone are advocates, I highly recommend that you use these assessments. And then the second question was, what if a victim keeps the documentation log but they didn't come forward to law enforcement? That's something that if you have a great prosecutor and if you need help with, educating your prosecutor or a prosecutor being able to educate a jury, please reach out to Equitas. We'd be happy to help you with those particular situations. But when we talk about the documentation log, an educated prosecutor who's familiar with the dynamics of stalking can easily say in those particular cases, yeah, the victim didn't reach out before because they were scared or they worried about reprisal, but this is actually what's been going on in all these particular situations. And most prosecutors will actually find them extremely helpful because it provides the background in these particular cases about what else has been going on that might not be included in this particular incident that's currently in front of the criminal justice system. So that's a great question, and I would say keep having victims use them, and if it comes up and the prosecutor has an issue with it, please reach out to us at Equitas. We're happy to provide some of that education about how they can educate the judge or the jury about that. But in my experience, usually prosecution or others who find out that the victims kept a log are actually super happy that they have, regardless of whether they went forward to law enforcement. But that was a great question. Are there any other questions that I'm missing, Emily?
This comment, since information could potentially be introduced as evidence or inadvertently shared with the stalker at future time, is it important to not include any information that the victim does not want the offender to see? And would it also be good to include a photograph of the stalker, photocopies of the restraining orders, police reports, and other relevant documents?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we always talk about when we're doing victim interventions like protection orders or going forward in criminal justice cases is we're just really making sure that victims are well aware of what information could be shared and what some of the potential risks of that are. So usually it's been my experience, like in stalking cases, that the information that's shared with a stalker is not a surprise to the stalker. They know they've been engaging in all this behavior. It might be a surprise that the victim documented it and shared it with the prosecutor, but the information itself isn't a surprise to the stalker, so it doesn't necessarily increase their rage or understanding or, frustration with a victim. It's just that they are surprised perhaps that the victim shared it with a prosecutor. So keeping it in mind that my standpoint when I work with victims is always just to say, let's think about what the potential consequences of including this information are. What I can also say is that many times I also have the same conversation about the more information we're able to give, the better safety planning we can do, but I always want victims to be leading the conversation about what they feel safest to doing. So if I have a victim say to me, I am absolutely not going to include this in my report, that's totally up to the victim, and I believe and support that victim in deciding that that's something that they don't want to share. It doesn't mean we might talk about the benefits of sharing something like that, but certainly I always want to, when we talk about victim safety, we have to rely and remember that victims are their own best resources. So keeping that in mind, I think, is really important. Any other questions that I'm missing, Emily? I apologize. For some reason, they're not showing up on my chat. It might be user error, but...
No, we covered so far, and there might be others, but you can keep going. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks for bringing those to my attention. So let's talk about some of the things that SPARC can offer to you. Obviously, training like we're talking about today, and we only had an hour today, so today was like a brief overview. My hopes in any training is that I gave you just enough information that you want more information. So I know that we can't possibly cover everything, but I'm hoping at least spark some ideas, about what you can continue to do within your community. And we're happy to provide you with more information. Just reach out to us. We're going to share our contact information at the end of the day today. So we're happy to help you with some training issues. We're going to be offering ongoing webinars, quarterly webinars that will really focus on some of those emerging issues that are coming forward. So webinars are always a great way to get information, but we provide in-person training as well. So if you're an OVW grantee and you are planning a conference and you would love to have Stalking be a part of that issue that you're discussing and providing training on, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to work with you to figure out how we can best meet your needs. And then we're really going to start working on some of those resources that are available for you, not only in your work, but for training as well. And so I think the things that we need to continue to think about as we move forward that can be helpful to you is, number one, what's the goal of SPARC? It's really to try to help professionals have access to the tools that they need to be able to promote victim safety. Et cetera. So the other thing that I would mention to you as when we talk about SPARC is, as we're talking about our training, not only do we provide the quarterly webinars, but we provide custom in-person training. So one of the things that we try to work really hard on when we're providing training or technical assistance to you is really getting a good understanding of what's the particular issue in your particular community. We know no two communities are alike. I always think I've heard it all or have experienced it all or come across every barrier, and I never have. So we're happy to help you continue to figure out what that is. For the web-based resource modules that we're going to offer, our hope is as we get our website up and going, what we would like to do is provide trainings that those of you that are responsible for community education within your community could get on our website, download, for instance, like a Stalking 101 training, have the materials that you need, the videos that you need, and be able to go out and give that training in your community. We are tasked with training on the national level, and we cannot be everywhere. So we want to be able to share that information with all of you, know that all of you have the relationships within your community that are going to make some of those trainings more effective. So our hope is that as we get those modules up on our website, that you would use those in your efforts. And then we'll also have within this first 2 years a conference specifically on the issue of use of technology to stalk. We know that the staying ahead of the curve for technology is difficult for all of us. So that particular conference, we're doing in collaboration with our amazing partners at the National Network to End Domestic Violence Safety Net team. So we'll be collaborating to provide that conference. So be on the lookout as that continues to come up within the next couple of years. And then really focused on technical assistance and what we can do if it comes to like your policy and protocol development. What are you coming up with in those particular cases? If you have particular cases that you just want another set of eyes and ears on that you want to brainstorm with somebody, please reach out to us, as well as providing some ideas and information for you on some of the safety strategies that stalking victims can utilize, many of which some of you who are advocates on the phone are very well versed in, and some unique ones that in particular to stalking. So for instance, what we hear oftentimes is victims of stalking are instructed to change their phone number, in which case is something we actually wouldn't promote, because what happens is if a stalking victim changes their phone number, the stalker doesn't just stop stalking them, they actually show up in person. And so really understanding that some of the safety strategies that we may have in place also need to be considered, in particular when it comes to stalking issues. And then the resources that we'll be providing not only on our website, but also available to all of you who are trained in technical assistance, are looking at your state statutes and helping you understand what those can and cannot do, and helping understand where, if you have legislation going forward, consultation about how perhaps information can be shared that could increase the effectiveness of those, understanding what those awareness-raising activities could be or could look like, as well as some discipline-specific. So one of the benefits of having so many partners on this project is that we're really looking to create discipline-specific resources. So guides for victim advocates, guides for investigators, guides for prosecutors, as well as victim resources. So it's something that we're really looking forward to and really excited about. And please reach out to us if there's specific things that you think aren't available now that you really would like to have available to the individuals that you work with. So I want to cover there were a couple of other questions that have come up. In the meantime, I'm going to put our contact information up on the slide for you. That's my personal email address at Equitas, so please reach out to me if you need training and technical assistance issues. I'm happy to help you with those. Until our stalking specific website gets up, you can find out information on the Equitas website, which is listed on the link above there. You would just look under initiatives, and it has the SPARC initiative under there, and can explain how to contact us and what information we can provide. The other thing that I would say, so I'm going to look at a couple of, someone said that when it talked about the documentation log, but just a reminder, and this is a great reminder, so thank you, Sandy, that obviously we don't want victims editing their log before they share it with anybody, because that obviously complicates issues when it comes to evidence and evidentiary issues. So obviously I would absolutely agree. We don't want victims modifying that information. We just want victims to know, what they put on that information is going to be shared with the defendant, and let them make informed choices as they're going forward. So thank you, Sandy, and Melissa, absolutely, who's reiterating, yeah, you can't just use selectively edited information, and that providing all of it can prevent a case from being prosecuted. I think it's important to keep in mind as we move forward what we're utilizing the documentation log for. Is that because we want to get a protection order? Is it because we're going forward in a criminal case? Absolutely. We want to make sure that when we're working with victims for that documentation log, if we have our eye on using it as part of evidence, then absolutely we wouldn't want victims to edit that in any way. So thank you both for bringing that to my attention. I'm sorry if that seemed like something that I was encouraging victims to do. It absolutely wouldn't be something that we would encourage victims to do. We just want victims to make informed choices about the information and where it's going. So absolutely, you don't want victims to be editing anything, because we don't want problems coming down the line when it comes to prosecutors. So thank you for the prosecutors on the phone who brought that up and brought our attention. And if there's anything else you would want to add to it, please let us know. Just reading a couple more questions here. Melissa just added that, as a prosecutor, they might be able to establish that sharing would cause harm to a victim in the future. So just a reminder as you're working on those documentation logs, what's being put forward, and absolutely you don't ever want victims to edit anything that would cause problems in the future when it comes to prosecution. So thank you for all on the phone who offered up that advice and reminder to those of us that are doing this work. So I appreciate that. Any other final questions or information that you would all like to volunteer to everyone else on the call before we end up today? I noticed that Alicia has put up some of the links, the web links for us. And again, my contact information is up there. Please reach out to us. I'm so thankful for the work that all of you are doing. I appreciate the collaboration. I appreciate the continued dialogue that we had on the webinar today, so thank you for that. And I encourage you all to think about how do you continue to increase your efforts both on the awareness side and the resource side when it comes to stalking. So thank you all for spending an hour on the phone with us today. I know you're busy and have lots to do, so we appreciate everything that you're doing. And anything else that anybody wants to add before we sign off? Emily, is there anything else that came up?
Nothing else that came up, but yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for presenting, and thanks to everybody who's been participating. We did record this, so I'll be sending out a link to the recording within the next day when it's available, and you can share it with colleagues or anybody from your office that may have missed this hour with us together. And part of the links that we have at the bottom of the page is also a survey, and I'll include that in the final email to you all along with Jennifer's biography. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope that you always know that we're here for you, and we'll see you again next time.